It's my pleasure to introduce today Oliver Stiedl, who is a member of work group 2 of the TEATIME Cost Action, which is devoted to home cage monitoring systems. And he will tell us today about assessment of conditioned fear in an automated home cage environment. So please start, Oliver.
Yeah, thank you for the chance to give you some ideas about my experience over the last couple of years. And if I look back, of course, it's scary how time passes. So what I'm going to do today is I will give you an idea about just very fast and briefly classical fear learning tests. What is the gold standard? I'll give you some idea about the why, the motivation for our home cage-based fear learning approach. I will tell you then the how, what we selected and which components we have developed, because this is a customized system. Some of the motivations underlying this. Then I will show you plenty of data and approaches, which of course are very interesting in the viewpoint of automation. And then I will of course conclude and give you a perspective on this. And I hope that we will have ample discussions on different issues. Of course, it will be a little bit biased based on my own experience, but nevertheless, I would say fear conditioning, as I said here, is a assessment on a specific domain that is, I think, more relevant for everything that we are doing, more or less. Yeah. So let's move on with the first part. Of course, you all know freezing, and I have really started to learn freezing in the 90s, where still everything was mainly visual observation. So I learned fear conditioning in USA in a famous group, and I then started to develop the first automated system because I was not convinced that if we have not automated, unbiased measures, that we are not able to draw the right conclusions. And this is, of course, the issue that we have an operational definition of freezing, which is the lack of movement besides respiration. That, of course, by all automated systems often is not validated. We don't know what they are actually measuring. And just to give you an idea, I have at one point with this master student put out movies that have been assessed by 15, 20 scientists. And the variation of the results that were returned were so scary that I had to put a ban on the publication of this based on a dispute I had within my neuroscience community. So this tells us that, of course, we have a dilemma here, and I will come back to this, because this is one of the reasons why I like fear conditioning for certain purposes that I will highlight later, but I also have my doubts about certain issues. I'll show you a paper which is really old. It's from the 1999, and it's a strain-substrain comparison where we look at the performance of C57 Black 6, 2 substrains compared to DBAs. And what we see is, in general, the C57s show decent freezing or high freezing, good performance, whereas the DBAs don't show a lot of freezing. Actually, we have confirmed this with autonomic measurements, and we know that despite their activity suppression, they are not good freezers. And of course, this confirmed, partly at least, previous data that show that, of course, DBA are inferior to C57 strains, and DBA have been often reported as being hippocampally impaired strains. Just to note, at the time when we started, we didn't know the difference between 6J and 6N. Now I'm very keen that you really specify the substrains, because there are even differences here that we saw at that time, and I will show you we confirmed later on in the home cage as well. Another issue, when I moved to Sweden and I worked with Vöikar, I really was more engaged with a passive avoidance task. And what I will show later on is a hybrid of fear conditioning and passive avoidance, because the passive avoidance learning has been, of course, the original form of fear assessment. It's, of course, an instrumental response. And to be honest, in my hands, contextual fear conditioning and passive avoidance have led to the same consequences. I have a history of work with Vöikar in Sweden. First started out at Max Planck, now later in Sweden, now in the Netherlands, where whatever I did in mice and serotonergic interventions in passive avoidance or fear conditioning, we always had the same conclusions. Whether I did it or whether someone else did it in Sweden with rats, we had the same conclusions. So at least we can say we had a robust, let's say, outcome of what we did. Of course, I have tested the DBA in comparison to C57s. And again, the same issue is that the DBAs are inferior to the C57 mice. And that confirms many, many studies. But I have later picked up on some experiments where I can clearly show it's not an DBA impairment per se, and I will show you data on this as well. We then picked up to look at extinction, and we found that the C57BL6N mice do not extinguish freezing to the conditioning context and to the tone, whereas the 6J do. We did a study subsequently, and it is still not published, on 6Ns in the passive avoidance task compared to 6Js, and we can see that a subpopulation of 6Ns also do not show extinction. However, extinction tests in passive avoidance are hardly explored. But I can tell you, this is, in my view, the better task if you really want to acquire objective measure, because the dilemma here is that if you have animals exposed to a certain environment repeatedly, they drop with their activity because they are in a familiar environment. The motivation to move is decreasing, whereas we want them to increase activity in order to counteract or as an index of removal of fear. And this is, of course, counterintuitive. And I can tell you, I can hardly find convincing papers where an objective classification of fear extinction has occurred. And this is a big dilemma. So I have put up some critical issues here. The critical issues for me are unbiased objective assessment of freezing and fear conditioning. Many software packages provide you with some radiation of features, but no one knows exactly what they are. There is no common standard on this. What is freezing? What is the level of activity that you tolerate as respiration as opposed to a real active suppression of ongoing behavior? Freezing is a response indicative of a passive coping style and is unsuited for active coping. I have seen animal lines, when the tone is switched on, they start jumping and try to escape and run around. Of course, they are good learners, but they don't show it on the level of freezing. So what the hell are we concluding? So that was the reason why I actually used a lot of cardiovascular measurements, which are much better suited under certain conditions, but only under certain conditions. So, of course, in my view, freezing, and I recently visited a good old colleague in Denmark, Ewelina, who did a lot of studies on extinction. The issue is still what is a good unbiased measure of freezing, and I'm really concerned there, to be honest. And I will show you some intriguing data based on my studies. Then the final thing is, of course, what is the readout and what is the translational validity of freezing? Of course, there are reports that freezing occurs transiently after challenging humans, but is this let's say, a response to refocus or whatever, or is this an expression of fear? Actually, I have to challenge also startle responses, because startle responses are startling in a particular environment associated with the context, but not the startle response itself. I've done studies with students. Startle response is a reflexive motor response. The conscious awareness about the fear comes subsequently. If I startle mice in a neutral environment with an acoustic insulation, there is no tachycardia. It's an attention response. It only comes up if I do this in a conditioned context. And unfortunately, the restraining conditions for startle experiments are so tough that animals that would voluntarily go into startle box when they are naive would never re-enter the startle box once they have been in a session, because they associate this. So what are we doing? So my point here is we have to be looking at alternatives. Of course, avoidance as an objective measure based on latencies and posture analysis. I will show you some data on this. And as I propose also an objective measure as in extinction tests. Avoidance is a cross-species measure with high translational validity. So My strength on fear conditioning is it is the most important task to dissect molecular and cellular pathways involved in learning and memory by interventions in brain area selective manner within a strain. But for comparison among strains and extinction and other things, I am not so sure about this. Yeah? And the weakness, of course, is how can we rely on the change of freezing and use it as a transferable translational measure for extinction of PTSD-like issues. This is, in my view, a little bit over the edge. And of course, I will come back to this because I think this is where we are having a problem, because avoidance is better suited. And while I say this, I realize that I missed to insert a nice ecological rent slide, but I will mention it anyway. So of course, in general, we all know that we have several problems when we do now behavioral tests that are short-lived. The experimenter as an uncontrollable variable. Here is an old example, but a very classical example that the smell of and the musk smell of the experimenter has a differential effect on activity of mice, in this case rats, and of course are opposite. So the experimenter by itself is an issue. The olfactory cues that are associated with it are a second issue. So we need to avoid them. Another thing is the way how we handle them. I don't want to go in details. It's very clear that the way how we get the animals out of the cage already have an impact on the subsequent test in the next 5 minutes. Cup handling is preferable, or tunnel handling to handling by tail, particularly when we deal with autonomic tests. And this is also very clear and of course known for long times. Finally, of course, we know the issue of novelty. Substantial increase in arousal, locomotor activity, and heart rate, increase in sympathetic function and parasympathetic withdrawal, neophobia, forced instead of intrinsic motivation to participate in a task. And of course, even here, this is a nice presentation, or nice figure from Pernold about the DVC, when just a simple cage change has a massive, long-lasting hyperactivity effect in the light phase. And that is an arousing status that we know for long. I have done this once, not published, with heart rate, and you see you change the cage and you put the animals back, the heart rate is reaching maximum physiological limits, takes hours to fade off. If you take material that has conspecific smell on board, the recovery is faster. So this is a very important feature, and all the tests that we are doing is in the top phase. I have had, I could tell you, I have had 50 emails from scientists asking me, what can I do with telemetry? And I can tell them, if you do telemetry in a novel environment, forget it, because it's useless, because you measure a ceiling effect. Yeah? So, and finally, and this is an important feature, since I always have been linked to psychology a little bit and also psychiatry, is this Yerkes-Dodson law. The performance as a function of arousal or stress. And the major issue is difficult tasks suffer from the negative impact of arousal, in that we have, instead of a, let's say, sigmoidal function, where in simple tasks we reach a maximum and the performance is then staying at this maximum, we know that there's a bimodal function where, of course, I always tell this to students, if you are not motivated and you have a low level of activation, then the performance will be low. But of course, if you increase your motivation, arousal, or stress, you reach an optimum. And if you, in the end, increase it even more, it becomes impairing. This is a principle from 1908 that is known in any environment. And as I said, of course, we are one of the victims of this as well, because we are always running on deadlines. A painter and a deadline does not work. A programmer and a reward does not work. It will lead to impairment. And of course, this old paper from Michael Diamond, or no, old paper, tells us fear conditioning. Yeah, and this is what I really have to show you is categorized as a simple task. And I'm not convinced, because we know it's a complex task in this involving hippocampal function. And I will show you the problem with fear and freezing is a condition response, but is an generalized response to any threat by an environment as an, of course, evolutionary adaptation. So in order to discriminate the specific from the unspecific response, particularly when you have generalized fear, is impossible. And this is something I will address when I show you my data. So based on all of this, at some point we wondered, with all the experience of fear conditioning and passive avoidance, we wanted to an experiment where the experiment comes to the mouse and not the mouse to the experiment. We wanted mice to deliberately, without coercion, participate in the task. We wanted the timing of we timed the initial test compartment to the locomotor activity that we observed in these systems, and thereby we avoided as much as possible all unspecific stressors. But of course, the experiment now becomes a longitudinal experiment, as you can see here. In order to do this, we developed our own systems because we thought there is not really something available on the market. And as I will show you later, we developed it in a way where we thought we have to be flexible. We don't want one test for one essay or one design. We want something that is flexible. We need flexibility in the future. And actually, we have modified this in different experiments now, where instead of doing fear conditioning, we have another add-on with a figure 8 maze or other tests. We have implemented here, for example, the 5-choice zero action time test. And if the animals decide when to do it and how to do it, the time to solve tasks is down to 7 days. We have published many studies. I'm not involved in all of them, but I think we have published with Martin Loos and others in the meantime 20 or 30 papers on this. And this is a big issue because it tells us there is something different in the performance that we can see. Now, of course, there is an issue with one cage. You don't get very far. So we developed in the end 10 cages. We have an excellent fine mechanic electronic department. We coupled them at that time with BioObserve software. Unfortunately, we stopped in 2018, and I don't know whether BioObserve even exists. We used 3-point tracking. The software is now completely outdated. We developed our hardware controllers, USB TTL, to implement anything that we have already in the lab. And I can tell you, we have TSE equipment, we have made associated equipment. We implemented whatever we can use, and this works and is possible. Then, of course, we use 2 cameras on the top to track the animals. And we use the video as quality control, and of course, important aspect to contribute also to quality control of data analysis. This was a very big venture. Of course, we had an EU subsidy at that time. And then, of course, we had 10 PCs running this in the neighboring room. And we had remote access to the computers and even could control experiments and stop and open doors from home and see what the status of the animals. I can tell you, if I consider now what we have been doing 10 years ago, I think we were far ahead. I will show you some basic data, which here you see, and in the small panel you see the time scale. And I should go back one slide. Here, excuse me, in the timeline of the experiment. Let me get rid of this. In the timeline, you see we exposed the animal to the new home compartment. We habituated the animal for 3 days to the home compartment. Then we opened the door for the training session. Then when the animal returned immediately, we closed the door. Then we have the consolidation time, and then we performed the retention test. And now I will show you data from different parts of this experiment. In the little cartoon indicated that this is the initial activity. When we insert the animals, all the animals are hyperactive. Of course, then they slowly entrain into their own endogenous rhythm. We used at this moment male mice singly housing, particularly for the reason that we know a high level of emotional contagion will affect the behavior of other mice. So if you have group housed animals, it will inflate the variation between the individuals. Our assumption was we would remove variation based on our own contribution. And I will come back to this later. So in this, consistent with other data, I can tell you we have a similar initial activity. We see significant differences between big black 6N and 6Js repeatedly in also different measurements. We have an anticipatory activity increase at the end of the dark phase. And in the end, we have a low activity that partly is also a little bit inflated by the noise of the cameras and so on. But actually, we recently confirmed this, that this is exactly the same pattern that we see in the DVC. Now, when we do the training, and this is now the red box here, you see what we can measure is, based on the center of gravity, the movement in the home compartment as a function of time. And when we open the door, the animal will move over. It will be enclosed in the test compartment. It will receive no shock if it's a no shock group. And then it will, if the door opens again, will move back immediately, because animals are really keen to have confirmation from their home cage. The shocked animals show exactly the same pattern. But what you already see here is that there is a drop in activity. And what we noticed is there is a profound, almost 2-hour long lasting suppression of activity simply by the shock exposure. Something that we don't know from regular experiments, but a shock exposure by itself as an unconditioned response can be nicely monitored and tracked. And I can show you later that this is really an unconditioned response. If you look at the training part, you see opening the door in the beginning, and this is the reason why, let me go back. We started to open the door. We opened the door always 1 hour after the shutdown of the light, because we often have animals that were still asleep. And once we have an animal, and this is exactly explained here, one guy was still asleep. In the beginning, we had such a noisy door that we had to replace it because the animals were so scared by the noise of the door that the transfer latencies were much longer. But after changing the door, the transfer latencies are short. The animals are novelty seeking, and if they have the chance, they like to explore. Novelty seeking is the only motivation to go over. The non-shocked animals 24 hours later move over, as you can see, within half time, and this is like an inverted Kaplan-Meier statistics that I recommend you to use, because of course you have certain cutoffs, but you see the half time is roughly half a minute. And if you look at the retention tests, this is a very different dimension. First of all, you see every step indicates the response of one individual mouse. In the light phase, there are no responses. And here are subsequent responses. The end of this curve tells us that one of the individuals never dared to go back after even 48 hours. Here the time scale is 48 hours. Since the start of opening the door till entering the door, we never had a single mouse that after a normal shock, as we used in our conditions, dared to move over at a time that has been ever described in any of the classical tests. That does not exist. So what is happening in the classical tests? Yeah. Here in the 6N mice, you see it takes them longer before reaching the halftime, and the higher fraction of animals does not dare to go over. This is the interesting aspect of from the viewpoint of PTSD-like. But what we notice is, of course, rather than reducing variation, we are inflating variation substantially. The inter-individual variance is substantially increased. Now I will show you a brief movie. It's sped up 10 times. It shows a mouse in the home cage. Before the door opens, it is the phase of the retention test. It's the time before the door opens for 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes when the door is open. And take a look at the behavior of the animal and how its posture is, what it does, and how it changes as soon as the door opens. Here is the door. You will see in a minute when it opens. Here is a water spout. In the beginning, we had food on the bottom. We have changed, of course, a lot in the meantime, and I will give you some ideas on this later. So you can see by opening the door a massive difference in the behavior. Now the animals show complete avoidance and keep the longest distance possible for them to stay away from the door. Be aware, this is in the dark. There is, of course, the vision cannot provide this information. It must be intrinsic information about the location, but it senses this. The animal has been sitting in front of the door before the door opened, was grooming, and did not show any sign of arousal or fear or whatsoever. You see steps of a stretch and attend postures towards the door. And now we can quantify this. Only the open door is an explicit threat. The threat has a target. And this is important here because in fear conditioning, we don't have a real target. Of course, we know from ethological experiments that the magnitude of the fear is proportional to the distance between the animal and the threat, particularly in predatory animals. This is known. So the first thing is that we noticed, oh shit, the cage is too small, even though we have already a 40 by 30 centimeter cage, which is larger than any type 2 or whatever cages. We need a larger cage to really get the glimpse of what would the distance be that the animals would keep. We have animals that had a nest at the door side. After the door was open, they moved their nest out. So we can see all kind of really solid avoidance responses that we don't have to argue about what they mean. Based on this and based on the 3-point tracking, we can now plot the distance of the position in the cage relative to the door in no-shocked animals, and we see the door opens, the animals go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The going back to the home cage is reinsurance. It's arousal management. The body length plotted here, and this is the raw data, is somewhere intermediate. Animals with a shock show the same pattern in the beginning, but as soon as the door opens, now they show this very spiky behavior where they are in the back and then they move to the door. Here is the first time after more than 10 minutes that the nose tip is peeking through the door of the test compartment. You see, this is highly correlated here with the body posture. The closer the animals they are to the door, the longer they get. We can nicely do a correlation analysis on the body length and can fit this, and it's clear that this is a very nice index of the fear magnitude. And we know that after extinction, the slope is 0. We know that the slope fit is really indicative of the fear, and I will show you some other measures. And the body length, even in unconditioned, when they are naive and they explored for the first time, they also show a stretched attend posture because it's a novel situation. Yeah? Now, let's take a look at the within-session extinction. When you open the door in non-shocked animals of either substrain of black 6, they explore it immediately. What we noticed is that the mice use their nose like a sensor to cross everything and to sniff out every corner. And we noticed in the beginning that the black 6 chase, the longer it takes them to make a decision, the slower they progressed. So that would fit with the idea that if you are more anxious, the progression would slow down. But we know that the big 6, black 6N are the ones that do not extinguish in the classical tests. So we expected them to show this even more pronounced. But to the contrary, you see, they take longer to make the decision to enter. But once they make the decision, they progress fairly similarly. So what the hell are we measuring when we artificially chop up extinction in classical tests in short delays when they don't know what they extinguish because they are confused what the target is? So I really start wondering, what is extinction about? What is the natural form of extinction? How does it occur? And how is it expressed? So I'm a little bit worried that the assays that we are using are really not very useful and very artificial. So we measured the half time to explore, and there is no difference between the strains. So the difference is maybe the difference based on the stress exposure in the novel situation again. Actually, we wanted to find out because we have many measures that we can extract in a heat map-like manner. is something predictive of the delayed entry, but we cannot find anything from our internal data that would be indicative of this. But we have a lot of data that shows that certain features are stable across time, even before and after shock exposure, such as inter-individual differences in activity. And of course, this has been corrected by false discovery rate to make sure that there are no false positives. Very important when you do multiple comparisons. Now and this is unpublished data, instead of giving one shock, we used actually a no shock, a late shock group, and I'll come back to this later. I'll skip it for the moment. I'll explain this later. We used 1 shock, 3 shocks, 5 shocks. And if you do this, what we noticed is 1 shock and 3 shocks hardly has a difference. Of course, there is a bigger proportion of animals avoiding, but if you give 5 shocks, they move over much faster. So here we see 5 shocks produce an impairment in the retention test in 6 Ns. So we can rank this, and this is statistically significant. We did the same with 6 Ns. The 6 Ns are shown here. 1 shock, 3 shocks, 5 shocks. There's already an impairment only by 3 shocks compared to, there's already a difference because this is already a significant difference. And if we have 5 shocks, we see a portion that is responding very fastly and the rest never dares to go back. So this is an interesting cohort from the viewpoint of PTSD-like behavior. So now we have the idea that, of course, there are differences that point clearly in what I have concluded in the first part, and I'll come back to this, that stronger reinforcement will impair the avoidance response very drastically. And to be honest, there are very few data showing this. In fear conditioning, there's none. Every stressor related to the training will only increase the fear. And in passive avoidance, there are a few studies that I can find that show stress-induced impairment on avoidance learning. In contrary to what we expected, the variation, particularly in the latencies, is dramatically inflated. So I have the feeling that the low variation that we often see, still it's a large variation, but look, we are talking a time scale of up to 24 or 48 hours, is artificially condensed in the short tests. Now comes the second part. I showed you before the DBAs in all the classical tests are impaired. We can clearly see that in the training they are more careful to enter. They show a higher degree of thigmotaxis, confirming our anxiety tests. When we test the non-shocked animals, they have no problem to move over. They are very fast. There is no significant difference here. And look at the time scales. Again, we are talking about within a minute. Now we do the retention test and we see exactly the same wide distribution range where we have animals that learn it well. And look, the avoidance also starts with a very long delay. So this confirms to me that we have to be aware that some animals that are more stress susceptible are much more sensitive when it comes to unspecific stressors impacting on cognitive performance. And I can tell you, I have done in the meantime spatial learning tests with DBAs. And if you do different reinforcement, they are indistinguishable from C57 black 6 mice. Yeah. Again, here is one of the few daytime responses. Just to give you an idea that the shock per se is not a traumatic event. We had a software failure in the beginning where we did not deliver a shock and we gave a shock after 60 minutes and we filled up this group and we called this a delayed shock group. So the animals, when they move into the shock compartment during training, are confined for a defined time interval, then exposed to a single shock. Then the door is opened, all the animals return immediately. You don't need any motivation. And then you can test them 24 hours later. And when you do this, the no-shocked animals and the 60-minute delayed shock are significantly different. But in the time scale, this is minutes. Whereas if we look at animals that really respond, it starts the earliest if the delay is 7.5 minutes or shorter. all the other animals show the same post-shock suppression of activity, but on the next day they move in and they prefer to explore, and they are not associating this with an aversive situation. There is no fear conditioning and avoidance visible. Yeah? And we can show this nicely by the re-exploration. They start re-exploration right away. Look, there is no difference from the non-shock control group. It starts with the fear group with some individuals that clearly show learning, and only if the time is shorter, they clearly show avoidance. So we have to be careful if we talk about shocks as a very severe stressor, because in my view, this is not the truth. Actually, we have data from animals that have been enriched and have been tested in many tasks. If you do fear conditioning with them, they behave like non-shock controls. They are not impressed by the shock anymore. It's not that they are stupid. No, they are not associating this as a stressor anymore. They are not bothered by the shock. So what I have to conclude from this is, you have to be careful when we look at this essay, because in my view, we have to split up the different strains, and using one kind of motivator is insufficient to characterize whether there are really cognitive differences. And this is a mistake that we are doing all the time. We use one reinforcement and make a conclusion. But we know it from our co-workers. Some of them are stress susceptible, some are stress sensitive. We have to tailor the workload on the demands. And this is something we should do in order to be creative for ourselves as well. And we know we have to deal with this. Yeah. And we have to take care that in many of the studies, and I can tell you it applies to APP and other mutants, many of them are very anxious. They show a high degree of anxiety-like behaviors, and they are very poor in subsequent cognitive tasks. If you remove the unspecific anxiety-like stressors, or anxiety-inducing stressors, you get the real performance, and then it looks different. And if we do not delineate this from another, we are continue to draw wrong conclusions, and this will jeopardize the credibility and replicability of science, and of course support for animal research. And I think we have to be very clear about this, and therefore I think the home cage is the only way to go. So home cage-based approaches are substantial refinement due to the deliberate choice of the mice, no coercion. Of course, we can use now unambiguous behavioral measures, and I just come back. The stretch attend posture is more than 70 years or almost 70 years old. Let's use what we have because it's out there. Only use the technology in a decent manner to draw really unambiguous conclusion. We should shy away from tests that are ambiguous. Of course, the negative of unspecific stressors on emotional responses, cognition, motion must be eliminated. And of course, I have been now, although I'm very keen and I really enjoy the paper of David Wolfer about the Morris water maze test. But my conclusion on the Morris water maze test is that it's not a really good cognitive test, because based on the factor analysis they performed, it is mainly an anxiety test, and it does not dominated by cognitive performance. And we know that many of the strains that show perform deficits in this test do not perform deficits in other tasks. So we have to be careful. And this is an important issue. Of course, we must combine our scientific approaches with improved replicability and welfare aspects. And I think this is the way why I'm very, let's say, convinced that TEATIME will help us to improve here on a massive scale. Because I have written a paper with a lot of colleagues where, of course, this is a big issue, replicability. And let's hope that this can help us to do this. And of course, this is the reason why I think I'm intrigued that this will be the new standard, but we fight against, of course, people that defend the old methods with teeth and claw, despite the fact that we have the feeling we know it's not optimal, and we have to be aware. And I showed you my own data. I have to conclude that my old papers that have been published are wrong with regard to the conclusion that the DBAs are inferior to C57 mice because it's affected by unspecific stressors. And consequently, we must stop behavior tasks that have no added scientific value and unnecessarily compromise animal welfare. And I'm very strict on this because I'm now sitting here in the position of the chairman of the animal welfare body, where I have big arguments where if people now run certain tests without the controls, whether certain animals are more anxious, they cannot draw the right conclusions. And this is a mismatch that we have to really resolve. Yeah? Perspective. Based on all of this, my proposal is, because we know this is a complicated and costly and of course complicated venture. We need flexibility. Actually, we have developed and planned a little bit too far ahead already, because I'm now outrun by the technical dependencies. Because I have lost a partner that is driving all the analysis. And in my view, what we have to do is we have to shift to sustainable open platform sources. We have developed our own TTL control unit to make this possible. And I think we have to be very open. Many of us have equipment that would be well suited to do certain things, but it is not possible to integrate, because if we have closed platforms, it is becoming complex. Just to show you, of course, we have automated water bottles with doors that can be controlled here to provide access in a controlled manner. We have feeders, we have sliding walls that you can remove and exchange. It made it all possible. And I think this is the issue why I think we need a flexible platform, like something that is similar to R scripts, where we can exchange, share, and provide toolboxes. And only if the toolboxes are versatile are we willing to invest and expand, because of course academia doesn't have the funding often, and behavior research not at all. And it's a very demanding issue. And then we depend on people that have the money, but don't have the, let's say, the insight of what we are doing with these experiments. And this is an important issue that I think we have to address. So I need to explore and find new options for the future of the dual cage, because I'm really stuck now, because I don't have a tracking system and a software analysis system. But the good thing is I have video, which I used for monitoring, and it will be run in the future in such a manner. It's only not clear how I'm going to manage in the next years, or what we can maybe achieve within the TEATIME consortium. And I would be happy for suggestions from your side. And with this, of course, I have to thank a lot of people that contributed. A lot of colleagues contributed particularly to the conceptual background, especially Ilan Golani, who has been involved in many of these studies, and I still have a good connection to him because he's a very creative mind, sometimes very unconventional. He is sometimes under, let's say, too low in his interpretation of what the data means, but he is at least an objective behaviorist in this sense. Of course, that would not be possible, of course, with large fundings. And for a long time, we really were happy to work with BioBserve, but unfortunately, this has stopped. And now I'm in the situation to check what alternatives could be achieved to keep up with these aspects. And saying this, of course, the current DVC, as we know, is now a home cage-based phenotyping within one cage. But I just came from the Digital Vivarium meeting 2, and it's nice to see that now, of course, gates and everything are enclosed so that different cages are used. And of course, it follows some of the literature that we see and that has been reported, that we have to face more inter-individual variability in the animals as a core process that is not nice statistically, but that helps us and provides us with other opportunities as well. And with this, I thank you for your attention.